Welcome everyone to an explanation of a problem involving a restricted stock plan where the number of shares that would be vested in the employee depends on two things. First of all, the net income from 2019, so that's a performance-based standard, and number two, that they are still employed at the end of the vesting period. So we're going to assume for this problem that everyone that originally is part of the process stays employed for the entire time frame. We're going to look at a time frame of 5 years that we're going to be earning this compensation. Now, like all stock-based compensation, the amount of compensation that is determined or recorded is looked at right at the beginning, at the time of the date of grant. So, as the problem reads, depending on what net income is, they get a certain number of shares. So if net income is up to $1 million, at 25,000 shares. Now, we're predicting what the net income is for 2019. Now, that's somewhat of a prophecy, but we're going to use a procedure that basically says whatever net income is for the current year is the most likely scenario, and that's what GAAP tells us to use, is the most likely scenario, is the most likely scenario for our income for 2019, and therefore we'll adjust accordingly. So in year one, 2015, our net income is $800,000. We look at our chart that says that we will be issuing or granting 25,000 shares. They are worth $20 a share. That was established at the beginning. So that's a total compensation of $500,000. So if that's going to be earned over 5 years, we're going to record $100,000 in year one. So our debit to compensation expense and credit either unearned compensation or additional paid-in capital, depending on how you establish the restricted stock at the beginning. In 2016, a year has gone by, and we now have net income for 2016. Now that 1.2 million becomes our most likely scenario for 2019. So if that's our income, then the number of shares that we're going to grant is up to 50,000 because it's past that threshold. 50,000 times the original value, $20 a share, is $1 million. So we need to look at now the idea that we have $1 million that needs to be recorded as compensation expense over the 5-year period. So if that's true, then after 2 years you should have recorded 200,000 and 200,000, or a total of 400,000 in compensation expense. But we have only recorded 100. So for year two, you're going to record 300,000. That's going to catch you up. We don't go back and fix past years. We simply catch up, and therefore debit compensation expense and credit additional paid-in capital or unearned compensation. 2017, net income 1.8 million. That becomes our most likely scenario. That still is only worth 50,000 shares, same as the year before. So we still have $1 million for the course of the 5-year period. We're at the 3rd year, so we should have a total of 600,000 in compensation expense recorded. And we have, by recording 200,000 in year 3, you notice that we now have a total of the 3 years of 600,000. So debit compensation expense 200,000, credit additional paid-in capital or unearned compensation. 2018, net income jumps up again. We're now past that second threshold into the realm where we have 75,000 shares as the most likely scenario. So this 2.1 million becomes our most likely scenario for 2019. 75,000 shares, each worth $20. That's $1.5 million total compensation over the 5 years. Well, if you're at $1.5 million for 5 years, after 4, you should have recorded 1.2 million. So if you divide 1.5 by 5, multiply it by 4, you get 1.2 million. But in past years, we've recorded 100, 300, and 200. That's a total of 600. So we need a whopping $600,000 of compensation expense in year 4 to catch up with our new assumption of 75,000 shares. So again, we don't go back and fix past years. We simply go forward with our new total. Now, 2019 doesn't end up being quite as good. Now we know exactly, there's no more need for a most likely scenario. We know exactly how much our net income is and how many shares there are going to be. And we missed the threshold and only have 50,000 shares for employees. That's $1 million compensation expense. Problem being that we have already recorded 1.2 million based on our assumptions. We don't go back and fix past year assumptions. We simply record a negative compensation expense. So you credit compensation expense and debit your additional paid-in capital or unearned compensation. So that would be your journal entries for recording compensation given that scenario and the changes based on a performance-based situation.